Keanu Reeves arrived on the Jimmy Fallon Show expecting a normal interview, but one unexpected surprise left him completely speechless in front of the live audience. What followed turned the studio upside down, revealing an emotional truth that no one watching that night will ever forget. Keanu sat on the edge of the gray couch, adjusting his black jacket like a man who still wasn't used to being watched by millions. Across from him, Jimmy leaned forward with that familiar playful grin, but tonight there was something softer in his eyes, like he was hiding a secret behind the jokes. The band faded out, the audience settled, and for a heartbeat the studio felt strangely small, like a quiet room where two old friends were about to talk about something that actually mattered. Cameras rolled, lights burned hot against Keanu's face, and Jimmy started with the usual late-night rhythm. Movie plugs, stunt stories, a few easy laughs about Keanu doing his own fight scenes. The crowd roared when they replayed a slow-motion clip of him dodging punches, and Keanu smiled that shy half-smile, the one that never quite reached full confidence, as if he still couldn't believe people cared. But underneath the laughter, his hands stayed loosely clasped, thumb tapping against his knuckle, a tiny restless beat that only someone really watching would notice. He had done 100 shows like this, but something about tonight felt prepared, like a stage set for a scene he hadn't rehearsed. Jimmy shifted in his chair, playing with the note cards on his desk, and his voice lowered just a little. The audience reacted to the change without knowing why, their murmur fading into an expectant hush. "You know, man," Jimmy said, "we talk about your action scenes, your movies, how you're this legend, but there's another side of you people almost never see on TV." Keanu frowned lightly, confused, a hint of discomfort crossing his features. He preferred to disappear behind his characters, not stand in the spotlight as himself. Still, he nodded politely, shoulders tightening beneath the tailored suit. Without warning, the big screen behind them flickered from a movie poster to a shaky phone video. The sound of rain, the blur of a New York street at night, and there was Keanu, years younger, soaked through, kneeling beside a man who had just been knocked to the ground in a crowded subway entrance. This wasn't a movie scene. No cameras, no stunt team. Just a stranger in pain and an actor who should have been invisible in a passing crowd. The studio audience went quiet, the laughter evaporating. Keanu's eyes widened as he recognized the moment, a memory he had never mentioned to the press, something he thought had disappeared into the city like so many forgotten nights. On the screen, he was taking off his own jacket, wrapping it around the man's shoulders, talking to him calmly while people brushed past, umbrellas overhead, barely looking down. In the video, his lips moved, gentle and patient, but the phone mic caught only fragments. "You're not alone, breathe with me, stay with me." Back on the set, present-day Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees, jaw tightening as he watched his younger self refuse to walk away. He didn't look like a movie star there. He looked like a tired man who still chose to care. Jimmy cleared his throat, suddenly serious. "That clip was recorded by a woman who was on her way home from a double shift at a hospital," he said quietly. "She sent it to our team with a message. She says that night changed her life, and she's here." The audience gasped as the camera cut to a woman standing at the edge of the stage, hands trembling, eyes already wet. Keanu's brows pulled together, surprise turning to something deeper, like a door inside him had just swung open to an old, unfinished chapter. The woman stepped into the spotlight, hesitating, like she wasn't sure if she even belonged on that shiny floor under all those lights. She held something close to her chest, a folded piece of paper, creased and worn from being opened 100 times. For a second, she just looked at Keanu, as if checking whether the man in front of her was really the same one from that rainy night, the stranger who had knelt in the gutter without caring who saw. The studio was so silent that even the hum of the cameras felt loud. Keanu swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. I remember that night, he said, each word careful. There was an accident at the station. I stayed until the paramedics came. His hand drifted unconsciously to his chest, as if the memory had weight. He wasn't acting now. There was no script to hide behind, only a piece of his own history playing in front of him like a scene he'd forgotten to finish watching. Jimmy glanced at the audience, then back at Keanu, his eyes shining with something like pride and something like guilt, as if he knew he was about to push his guest into a place most celebrities never let cameras see. The woman reached the center of the stage and turned to the crowd, voice shaking but determined. "He didn't just help the man on the ground," she said. "He helped me. I was standing there ready to walk past like everyone else, and then I saw him stop." She looked directly at Keanu, her gaze steady now. "You don't know this, but that night I made a promise because of you, and I've kept it every single day for 10 years. Keanu stared at her, lost between disbelief and a dawning realization that the smallest choice he'd ever made might have been the biggest thing in someone else's life. Jimmy leaned forward, sensing the tension rise like a wave that could break either into tears or into something even more powerful. "Tell him," he said softly, almost a whisper. The audience leaned in as one, an entire room holding its breath, waiting to hear what silent vow a stranger could have forged from a rainy night and a moment of kindness. The woman unfolded the worn piece of paper with careful fingers, looked down at the words, then back up at Keanu with a tiny, nervous smile. And what she was about to reveal would not only expose the truth of that night, but force Keanu to confront a part of himself he had spent years trying not to need. "The promise." She steadied her breathing like someone about to jump into cold water. "That night," she began, "I had just finished a 14-hour shift at the hospital. I was exhausted, angry, and honestly, I was done." Her voice cracked on the last word and a soft murmur moved through the crowd. "I'd watched 3 patients die in one day. I'd been yelled at, ignored, blamed. I kept thinking, why am I doing this? Nobody cares. Nobody would even notice if I stopped trying." Keanu's expression shifted, his eyes softening with a recognition that came from his own bruised history. He knew that feeling too well, the quiet thought that the world would keep turning just fine without you. The woman continued, fingers still clutching the worn paper. "I was going to quit that night. I told myself I'd send the resignation email when I got home. I didn't want to help anyone anymore." Her gaze dropped for a second, as if ashamed to admit it, then she forced herself to meet his eyes again. "And then, at the station, I saw you." On the big screen behind them, the grainy video froze on the instant where Keanu knelt beside the hurt stranger, rain pouring around them like a curtain. The woman pointed at it. "You didn't know anyone was filming. You could have walked past like everybody else. You could have let the paramedics handle it alone, but you stayed. You talked to him, you gave him your jacket, you gave him time, you gave him dignity." Her eyes glistened now, but her voice had grown stronger. "And for the first time that day, I saw someone treat a stranger the way I wished people would treat my patients." Keanu shook his head slightly, almost embarrassed. "I just did what anybody should do," he murmured, but even he didn't fully believe that. If it were that normal, there wouldn't be a viral video. There wouldn't be a woman on a talk show stage 10 years later holding a creased promise in her hands. Jimmy stayed silent, letting the moment breathe, his usual jokes locked away behind a rare, thoughtful stillness. The woman unfolded the paper completely. "On the train home, I wrote something down. I told myself that if a man who lives inside movies and red carpets could still kneel in a puddle for a stranger, then I had no excuse. I decided I wouldn't quit, not that night, not because it was hard." She lifted the paper so the camera could zoom in. In messy ink, 3 short lines were visible. "If he can stop, I can stay. 1 more year, 1 more patient, 1 more chance." The audience exhaled as if they'd been holding that sentence in their lungs. She smiled weakly. "But it didn't last 1 year. It brought me here 10 years later." The weight of that number hung over the room, 10 years of exhausted mornings and midnight emergencies, 10 years of staying when it would have been easier to leave. Keanu's shoulders slumped as the realization sank in. A single unplanned act on a rainy night had pushed someone else to carry a burden for a decade. He swallowed hard. So you stayed at the hospital because of that? The question sounded almost guilty, like he was afraid of the answer. She nodded. I stayed. I specialized in trauma care. I signed up for the shifts no one wanted. Because every time I felt like walking away, I remembered you kneeling there, not as an actor, just as a man who decided that someone else's pain was his business, even for a few minutes. A faint tremor passed through Keanu's hands, and he laced his fingers together to hide it, but the cameras caught everything. The band members watching from the shadows had gone quiet too. Even they weren't immune to the gravity of what was unfolding. Jimmy finally spoke, his voice hushed. And that promise you made, is that what you wrote on that paper? She took a breath, like she was about to step off the edge of a cliff. No, she said slowly. What I wrote that night was just the beginning. The real promise came later, and it's the reason I asked your team to bring me here live with you in front of everyone. She turned toward Keanu more fully now, tears balancing on her lashes. Because what I have to tell you might change the way you see your own life. The audience leaned in. The tension wound so tightly that even the cameras seemed to hesitate for half a second before zooming closer on Keanu's face. Just as his lips parted to ask the question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The life you saved. Keanu's voice came out low, guarded. What do you mean, change the way I see my life? He wasn't on a movie set anymore where he could cut the scene or ask for another take. This was real, raw, and dangerously close to the parts of himself he preferred to keep in the dark. The woman inhaled deeply, grounding herself before stepping even further into her own story. A few months after that night, she said, a young man came into the ER. He'd been in a motorcycle accident. His injuries were bad, multiple fractures, internal bleeding, the kind of case that makes the whole room tense up. She closed her eyes for a moment, replaying the chaos, the alarms, the shouting, the metallic smell of blood and antiseptic. He was terrified, kept saying he didn't want to die alone. He was shaking so hard that we could barely stabilize him. The studio lights seemed suddenly harsher, like hospital fluorescence. Even the audience looked different in that moment, less like fans, more like witnesses. I was exhausted, she continued. I'd already pulled a double. Part of me wanted to be numb, to just do the job and move on. But then I remembered a man in the rain, talking softly to a stranger, refusing to look away from his fear. And something in me woke up. She nodded toward Keanu, whose eyes were fixed on her, unblinking. So I did what you did. I slowed down, I took his hand. I talked to him even while we were working. I told him he wasn't alone, that I was staying with him, that we were going to fight for his life together. Her lips trembled into a shaky smile. I used almost the exact words you said in that video. The words I'd memorized without realizing it, because I'd watched that clip on the train home again and again on my old phone. The audience was so silent now that the faint hum of the air conditioning could be heard. Keanu looked stunned, like someone hearing a melody they'd improvised years ago being played back to them as a symphony. Did he make it? He asked softly. The question broke through the tension like a small, desperate plea. The woman hesitated, and the pause was heavy enough to drag every heart in the room down with it. We didn't know if he would, she admitted. He coded twice on the table. His heart stopped. We brought him back. We lost him again. Every protocol said to prepare for the worst. But I kept talking to him. I kept holding his hand whenever I could. I kept remembering you in the rain, stubbornly human in a world that usually just rushes past. Her gaze sharpened, filled with quiet triumph. He survived. Against every prediction, he survived. A wave of relief rippled through the studio. a few people wiping their eyes, others exhaling loudly like they'd been personally holding that young man's life inside their own chests. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the news like a blow and a blessing at once. When he opened them again, they were shining. "I'm glad," he whispered. "I'm really glad he made it." But there was still confusion in his face, a question that hadn't yet been answered. Jimmy leaned in slightly, sensing the turning point. "So this young man, what happened to him after?" he asked, coaxing the next piece of the puzzle into the light. The woman looked down at the paper in her hands, then folded it carefully along the same old creases, as if closing a chapter. "That night after we stabilized him, I went to the waiting room to speak to his family. There was just one person there, a woman alone, terrified. When I told her we'd saved him, she collapsed into a chair, sobbing with relief. She kept saying, 'You don't understand, he's all I have left.'" Keanu's brow furrowed as a strange unease crept into his posture. He shifted, shoulders tense, as if some part of him already sensed the shape of what was coming but couldn't quite name it. The woman's voice grew quieter, more intimate, drawing him in. "She told me they'd both been through so much loss already, that they'd lost a daughter years before, that her son had been trying to be strong for her, but the weight of grief had never really left them." For a heartbeat, everything in Keanu's body went still. A daughter, years before. A family shattered by loss. These weren't just words to him, they were coordinates on a map he knew all too well. Memories flashed through his mind, hospital corridors, unanswered prayers, quiet funerals far from the cameras. His hand moved unconsciously to his stomach, fingers pressing into the fabric as if bracing himself against an invisible hit. The woman looked up, eyes locked onto his with a tenderness that made it clear she understood she was walking across sacred ground. "That woman in the waiting room, she showed me a photo." Her voice trembled. "A baby girl, and then she said a name I recognized, a name I'd seen on movie posters, a name I never forgot after that night in the subway." The audience collectively held its breath as the camera slowly, almost nervously, closed in on Keanu's face, just as a flicker of raw fear crossed his eyes, like he was about to hear a ghost speak his name from the past. The hidden connection. Keanu's throat worked as he swallowed, his pulse visibly beating at the side of his neck. What was the name?" he asked, but the words sounded like they were being dragged out of him. He seemed smaller suddenly, not the indestructible action hero who shrugged off explosions, but a man who had known more funerals than award shows. The woman took a shaky breath, glancing briefly at Jimmy, who simply gave her a small, encouraging nod. There was no going back now. "She said the baby's father was an actor," the woman continued gently. "That he had disappeared from their lives after losing them both, not out of cruelty, but because grief swallowed him whole." She paused, the silence in the studio turning from expectant to electric. "She told me her son carried that same grief, that he felt like he had to be strong because his father never got the chance to be. And then she said the name of the man who'd left." Her eyes never left Keanu's. She said his name was Keanu Reeves. The audience gasped as if the air had been punched out of the room. Someone in the back swore under their breath, then covered their mouth. On the big screen, the paused, rain-soaked video of younger Keanu suddenly looked different, like a missing puzzle piece that had finally slid into place. Keanu himself froze, everything in his face going pale and open, the careful walls he'd built over years of quiet interviews and polite deflections crumbling in an instant. "That's not that Ka," his voice broke. He sat back, then forward, trying to find steady ground in a story that had just yanked the floor out from under him. "You're saying the young man you saved?" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, as if naming it would make it too real. The woman nodded softly, tears now spilling freely down her cheeks. "Yes," she said, "the man on that table was your son." The words hit the room with the force of an explosion, but there was no music, no dramatic cut, only the raw sound of 100 people breathing in at once. Jimmy's eyes widened, his usual composure shaken. He hadn't known this part either. His surprise was as genuine as the audience's. All he could manage was a quiet, "Oh my God," under his breath, barely picked up by his own microphone. Keanu's hands rose to his face, fingers pressing against his lips like he could physically keep the emotion from spilling out. He had spent years carrying the ghosts of a child and a partner he'd lost, living carefully, privately, never expecting the past to send anything back to him but memories. Now, under hot studio lights and worldwide cameras, he was being told that a life he didn't even know had continued, had almost ended, and had been saved by a woman who'd once watched him help a stranger. I never knew," he whispered through his hands. "They never told me he'd—" He couldn't say the word survived. He couldn't say lived. Both felt too heavy, too sharp. The woman nodded, understanding, slicing through her empathy like a knife. "I know," she said. "I asked her why. She said she thought she was protecting him, and maybe trying to protect you too. She said you were drowning already. She didn't think you could survive another storm." Keanu stood suddenly, then sat back down when he realized there was nowhere to run. The audience watched, hearts in their throats, as he struggled not just with shock but with something deeper. A tidal wave of what-ifs crashing into the life he'd carefully built around the ruins of his past. His usually calm, almost reserved demeanor was gone, replaced by a rawness that made him look younger and older at the same time. The woman took a small step closer, hands open, offering not comfort but truth. "I didn't come here to hurt you," she said softly. "I came because he asked me to." That sentence shifted the entire energy of the room. For the first time since the revelation, there was a spark of something other than pain in Keanu's eyes, hope, fragile and disbelieving. "He asked you?" Keanu repeated, voice hoarse. The question wasn't just curiosity, it was a plea. A lifetime of absence, regret, and unanswered questions hung on her next words. The woman nodded, her lips twisting into a trembling smile that couldn't quite overcome the emotion flooding her face. "Yes," she said. "After he recovered, he found out about the video. He recognized you. It took him years to work up the courage, but eventually, he came back to the hospital. He found me. He asked me to deliver a message if I ever got the chance to meet you. And when your team reached out about the video, I realized this was that chance." The audience shifted again, an almost physical wave of energy rolling across the seats. They weren't just watching a show anymore. They were witnessing a collision of lives that no screenwriter would have dared to pitch as believable. Keanu leaned forward, breathing hard, like a man who'd been running all his life and had suddenly been told that the finish line was actually the starting point. What did he say?" Keanu asked, the words trembling out of him. He was no longer the controlled, media-trained guest. He was a father who had just discovered the existence of his son in front of millions of strangers, and his entire being was focused on one thing: the message that stood between the life he'd lived and the life he might still have. The woman unfolded the paper one last time, the creases so deep it almost came apart in her hands. She looked at it, then at Keanu, then back at the paper, as if trying to decide whether to read it or speak from memory. In the end, she did both, eyes on the page, voice full and shaking. "He said," she swallowed, every ear in the studio straining to catch the next words. "He said, tell him I'm alive, tell him I'm not angry, tell him I'm ready to meet him, if he still has room in his heart for one more second chance." The room blurred for Keanu. Lights, cameras, faces, all of it faded to the edges of his awareness. Those words, "I'm not angry, I'm ready to meet him," hit wounds he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten they could still bleed. He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, a broken, incredulous release that made several people in the audience start crying with him. For a long, aching moment, nobody moved. Then Jimmy, eyes glassy, leaned toward Keanu over the desk. "You don't have to answer this on TV," he said gently. "We can cut, we can go to break." But Keanu shook his head, surprising everyone, including himself. "No," he said, voice steadying as something like resolve began to rise beneath the grief. "If he was brave enough to send that message, the least I can do is answer it. Right here." He wiped his face with the back of his hand, took a breath that seemed to reach all the way down to the broken places in his chest, and looked directly into the nearest camera, as if he knew somehow that on the other side of that lens, a young man with his eyes might be watching. But before he could speak, Jimmy raised a hand slightly, his voice shaking. "Keanu, before you say anything," he said, glancing toward the side of the stage, "there's one more thing you should know. He didn't just send a message." Jimmy's eyes flicked to someone just out of frame, and a live wire of anticipation shot through the crowd. "He came here tonight,"